Inside the Whale by Jennie Rooney, read by Phyllida Nash and Bill Wallis. Stevie. My mum was in her element during that hot September of 1939. Over the years she had developed a nervous streak. We became accustomed to hearing her mutter about the dangers of the motor car as she chopped onions. She fretted about untied shoelaces and ribbons on cardigan sleeves. She balked at ponytails that could be yanked by any passing madman, and wrote letters to the Times about the perils of air travel, citing the misfortunes of a distant cousin who had been blown off course at the opening of the Greenwich Railway in a hot air balloon and had crash-landed on the railway arches at London Bridge. She believed that any child who had the misfortune to place so much as a slice of cucumber in its mouth, after having retrieved it from the floor, would face an imminent and almost certain death. Birthdays were particularly dangerous occasions as far as my mum, Vivian, was concerned. The very idea of carrying a cake, bursting with naked flames into a darkened room, made her left eye twitch. Vivian would lay a small bowl of water next to each person's plate, which we all had to clasp as the cake entered the room, our knees bent in readiness to extinguish the flames at the first sign of unruliness among the candles. We woke up early on the first Sunday of September that year, and it felt like Christmas Day. My brothers put on their school uniforms for church and left them on all day because everybody knew that if there was going to be a war, it was going to start then, and they wanted to be ready for it. I was wearing a pair of scrubbed white gloves that were reserved for special occasions and a navy blue pinafore that was getting rather too tight around the bust to be altogether seemly. The war was announced at 11 o'clock. We were all in Mrs. Bartram's yard at number 10, listening to Chamberlain on the wireless that she had balanced precariously next to a dead bee on the kitchen windowsill. Number 7 were there too. I picked up Mrs. Bartram's cat and ran my hand up its back towards its head. It growled at me as Chamberlain announced that we were at war, and I noticed that the inside of its mouth was a surprisingly fierce shade of red. I spent the afternoon with my younger brothers, Eddie and George, filling bags with government sand that had been left at the end of our road. At first we tried to be solemn, but the sand stayed between our toes and settled into the cracks of our hands, and the bags ended up bulging with turreted sandcastles and small sculptures of domestic animals. Meanwhile, our house was slowly filling up with water. Vivian was gleefully hiding brimming bowls under the settee and balancing full glass bottles next to our beds. She left heavy long-handled pans to ripple excitedly on the sideboard in the front room and hung rugs over the doors to allow for the quick smothering of fires. She lined the edges of the windows with putty and stuffed the chimney with newspaper. She placed a pile of neatly folded damp flannels on the mantelpiece in case of a sudden gas attack on the front room. It was generally assumed, although never openly admitted, that if any part of the house were going to be invaded, it would undoubtedly be the front room. It had the nice curtains, after all. We lined the sandbags along the front wall in keeping with this accepted proposition, and piled tins of condensed milk under the table in case of a siege. We planted cress in old cigarette tins and placed them on the windowsill to prevent scurvy. Vivian sighed happily as she looked around at all the precautions she was now allowed, if not obliged, to take. She slept more deeply that night than I had ever known, her hair splayed dramatically over the pillow and her arms hanging carelessly from the sides of the bed, snoring softly. So that is how I remember the beginning of the war. Wet flannels and sand and cress growing from damp cotton wool folded flatly in tins. There were no maps spread across the kitchen table, no series of small swastikas marking Hitler's progress through the smaller countries of Europe, like in the history books that came after. There was no talk in our yard of concentration camps, or of the rise of European dictatorship, or of German economic stagnation. I know all that now, but it has been added later, Let
Sample complete. Ready to continue?